All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Fred Iutzi from the Savanna Institute. We are grateful to the Nature Conservancy for sponsoring this session here in the Perennial Farm Gathering. And I'm going to turn for a minute to Lisa Kushner from TNC to give us a word here.
Thanks, Fred. We are proud to help support the PFG conference, and thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about the Nature Conservancy, or TNC. TNC is a global environmental nonprofit working to create a world where people and nature can thrive. Founded in the United States through grassroots action in 1951, TNC has grown to become one of the most effective and wide-reaching environmental organizations in the world. Food production is one of the most essential ways people interact with nature, yet agriculture is on the front lines of the dual global crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. Guided by science, TNC is collaborating throughout the food and agriculture industries, from farms and grazers to the boardrooms and Capitol Hill, to build a more resilient food system that benefits climate and nature and supports the well-being of a diversity of farms, ranches, and communities. For more than 30 years, we have worked with farmers and the larger agriculture industry throughout the United States. Through partnerships with other NGOs, including Savanna Institute, leading food and ag companies, and farmers and grazers on the ground, we are helping to change the conversation about agriculture's role in climate change and conservation while supporting the men, women, and families who grow our food and fiber. TNC is committed to delivering transformational change in the agricultural industry to support people, climate, and nature. Thanks, Fred.
Very good. Thanks, Lisa, and appreciate TNC's sponsorship and collaboration here on this. Yeah, welcome again to our attendees here. You are in the new funding opportunities for agroforestry farmers session. It is, as you may have noticed from the description, is about one particularly kind of large and diverse new funding opportunity, the Expanding Agroforestry Production and Markets project. Next slide, please. So there are three of us here who will be speaking over maybe 45 minutes, and then we'll hope to have 15 minutes for questions and discussion at the end. I am Fred Iutzi. I'm Director of Research and Commercialization at the Savanna Institute, and I will be doing a little bit of stage setting here about how this project came to be, a few things about how it's organized, and then I will address a couple specific topics that my teams are lead on here. And then I'll be followed by Audrey Epp Schmidt, who's North America Agroforestry Program Manager for TNC, and who really played a pivotal role in conceiving of this project and getting it off the ground. She'll be giving some more overview and context, and then focusing on the incentives, the payments that are available for farmers. And then after that, my colleague Barbara Decré, who's Agroforestry Programs Manager at the Savanna Institute, will be talking about the technical assistance, free technical assistance that's available to farmers here. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the full name here of this project is Expanding Agroforestry Production and Markets for Producer Profitability and Climate Stabilization. If that sounds like the title of a grant project, that's because it is. This is an initiative that's a funded grant from the USDA under the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities project. So this Climate Smart Commodities initiative here was conceived of as kind of the main on-the-ground kind of farmer-oriented climate change intervention of the early Biden-Vilsack administration here, and was more than a $3 billion offering, large even for a USDA grant program. And it, when it came out in 2021, there was a lot of food and agriculture stakeholders casting a lot of visions about how to tap into this project. That's very, very broadly addressing any agricultural crop or practice that makes a claim at reducing net greenhouse gas emissions. And so those of us in the agroforestry community were pretty clear in broad strokes right away that our vision for this was to see if a corner of it could be used to advance perennial agriculture and specifically to advance agroforestry. There were a lot of project ideas, some of which were state-based, some of which were regional in the Midwest, that the Savanna Institute was involved in sounding out. The way things ultimately went was that a number of stakeholders and a number of project ideas ended up kind of federating together under the leadership of the Nature Conservancy here to be one big agroforestry application. And so indeed, this project here, $60 million project, diverse set of players came together, and we were actually funded. So it's at $60 million. This is an exciting milestone in that it's undoubtedly the largest one-time new influx of funds into agroforestry in U.S. history. Also important to remember that it's $60 million out of $3 billion and out of a much larger kind of total farm bill pie here. So it's an important step. It's one important step on a long journey towards reorienting the focus of farm policy and of what we do in agriculture and what we support in agriculture in a more perennial and diverse direction. And so the framing that I'll give you for everything you're about to hear is that this is an opportunity for specific farmers to get payments and assistance to concretely roll out specific practices on their farms. This project will have a large impact all by itself. But more broadly, I think it's important to look at this as sort of an experiment or a test run here. What would it look like if federal farm policy, if the incentives that were available for agriculture, if the technical assistance resources that were available, if the investment of kind of scientific and market development resources, what if that were tilted towards perennial crops like trees, perennial ag systems like agroforestry? So within the bounds of what this project can do, we hope to make a persuasive case here over the coming years that a lot more things ought to look like that in terms of how the USDA runs and what farming looks like. Next slide, please, Barbara. So every Climate Smart Commodities or PCSC project has three pillars. The largest and really most important one is providing financial incentives and free technical assistance to farmers. But then the two supporting pillars are measuring, kind of rigorously quantifying greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration, and/or greenhouse gas flux, and then market development. And then next slide. And so, I'm going to briefly flesh out these two kind of secondary pillars for this particular expanding agroforestry production and markets project before I turn it over to my colleagues here to really focus in on the all-important farm production focused one. So the GHG measurement and reporting area here, one thing that's required for all these projects is that data be collected, that it be collected in a manner that's more or less scientifically rigorous, and then that it be reported, that it be disclosed to the USDA for the USDA's use in assessing the impact of this project and for research on the USDA end. So in our case, the sort of the secret weapon of agroforestry as a climate mitigation cropping system here is that it has potentially big impact both for carbon sequestration in the soil and for carbon sequestration in in living biomass or standing stock biomass. And so an important part of this project is that both of those are going to be monitored. We're going to lean on a couple companies that specialize in this. One called Working Trees for biomass carbon, and another called Yardstick for soil carbon, with all of that kind of backstopped with TNC and Savanna Institute scientists here. And then with a lot of involvement from the farmers that are participating, and to some extent the technical service providers or TSPs that are advising the farmers in collecting some of the data and providing feedback here on the process. So the opportunities here, other than that, we're required to do it as part of the grant program, the opportunities here are, number one, that we refine our knowledge on the climate benefits of agroforestry. And one thing I want to offer you here is that isn't a sort of an abstract or a side concern. Whether agroforestry is able to kind of hold its own as a truly transformational agricultural practice relative to much more incremental things that we could do in agriculture will depend on claiming all of the benefits that it actually delivers. We don't want to undersell its benefits for carbon sequestration. On the other hand, agroforestry being more than a bubble that inflates and pops is going to require that we don't overclaim the benefits. And so agroforestry is something that it's clear the benefits are high, but it's extremely valuable at this stage of the game that we really be able to put better numbers on that. And then the other opportunity here is this is an opportunity to do a trial run of what in the jargon is the MMRV process, the measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification process, that farmers who may choose to participate in future carbon markets, insetting or offsetting markets, will be signing up for. This MMRV they'll be signing up for if they choose to participate in future markets. It's a trial run for the companies and organizations that do it also. How do we, in the same vein, really do this process so it doesn't undersell or oversell? So next slide here, please. And then briefly here on market development. This is a required part of all these Climate Smart Commodities projects. I think across the board in the funded proposals, this was lightly budgeted for, and this project is no exception. It's extremely critical that it happen, though. Both the challenge and the opportunity for scaling up agroforestry on the landscape is that when we're doing, at least for harvestable agroforestry, fruit and nut trees and shrubs, markets have to grow in sync with production. That's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to get into a virtuous circle of expansion of the one supporting expansion of the others. In our case, we're going to be leaning very heavily on the National Agroforestry Coalition, a group that's just emerged in the last year and a half here, and specifically the markets working group that convenes within that coalition, that the Savanna Institute, the Nature Conservancy, that many other agroforestry and tree crop interested organizations are part of here, to basically serve as a clearinghouse on opportunities, and then on how to access the services of specific organizations that are working in a market development vein. The Savanna Institute, for example, has a program that stewards the commercialization ecosystem for agroforestry, and we and other groups will be working hard to make sure that people who do ultimately participate in this project don't go without markets here for what they're doing. So next slide here, and then I'll be handing it over to Audrey Epp Schmidt here to really dig into the core of the project here. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for teeing that up, Fred. So like Fred said, I'm Audrey Epp Schmidt. I'm the North America Agroforestry Program Manager with the Nature Conservancy, and helping to shepherd this large $60 million effort with many project partners that without them, it simply wouldn't be possible. So thanks, of course, to Savanna Institute for their partnership and collaboration on this large initiative. So next slide, please. Just to add a little bit more color to what Fred spoke about in terms of where did this $3.1 billion of funding come from? It's coming from the Commodity Credit Corporation, which is a tranche of funding that the USDA has that is specifically focused on helping to expand domestic markets for domestically produced goods. And it's really exciting that $3.1 billion of this is being leveraged to move the needle on climate smart practices on farms here in the US, and that agroforestry is a piece of that story. So really excited about that. Next slide, please. So if you guys are at this conference, you probably are familiar. There's 5 agroforestry practices recognized by the USDA. And for the purposes of this project, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please, we're really focusing on those first 3. We love riparian buffers. We love forest farming. Luckily, riparian buffers benefit from different water quality funding opportunities. Forest farming is obviously targeted more towards woodlot owners or forest owners. So we really chose to focus on these 3 because of the opportunities to expand agroforestry in croplands and pasture lands here in the US. And there's a 2017 survey that was done by USDA that showed that fewer than 2% of farm operations in the US use any agroforestry practice, any of those 5 practices. So there's a huge opportunity to get more adoption onto land here in the US. So next slide, please. I should quickly note on that last slide, you'll see the numbers after the practices. If you don't mind going back, Barbara, sorry for a second. Those numbers relate to the NRCS conservation practice standards. It's really important with this project that all of our projects follow NRCS's conservation practice standards. So just want to name that. Extra quick note on silvopasture as well. For this particular project, we're really focusing on additive silvopasture, what's sometimes called additive silvopasture, or otherwise new trees into pasture land. And we're not looking at subtractive silvopasture, so woodlot conversion to grazing isn't what we're focused on for this particular project. And it's also important to note that we're not looking to convert native grasslands into agroforestry systems. So next slide, please. So agroforestry obviously has many co-benefits, and it's really exciting to help push a lot of our different organizations' large goals. At TNC, we're focused on goals towards 2030 that are focused on climate and biodiversity. And for this project, it's really exciting to be able to tell the story of the win-win that farmers can be a part of climate solution while also building up their own economic resiliency. So that story around rural development and job creation is really key to advance with this project. And then obviously, as Fred noted, there's huge carbon sequestration potential given the biomass of all these trees that we're going to get in the ground. So next slide, please. So our project is $60 million. It's over the next 5 years. We're working across 30 US states, basically right the Midwest, Southeast, and then up north, and then as well as Hawaii. And our aim is to get 30,000 new acres of agroforestry planted over the next 5 years. And while we have about 15 formal partners as part of the budget of the grant and many other supporting organizations beyond even those, these 6 organizations you see listed here are really key and crucial for us. They are our regional lead organization. So Savanna Institute is our regional lead for the upper Midwest. You'll note that it's a mix of academic institutions, nonprofits, as well as for-profit. So really exciting to have sort of a cross-sector collaboration here to help advance this. So next slide, please. So we have 5 buckets of funding, and this kind of mirrors what Fred was talking about with the 3 pillars, but I'll just tease it out a little bit more. So really important piece of the work that we do is outreach, recruitment, and awareness building, doing education with producers so that they become more aware of agroforestry as an option to adopt as a conservation practice for their own operation. I think it's fair to say that agroforestry is not yet normalized in the US. And so the work that we do during the course of this 5 years is to get the word out and begin to normalize it. And if you can go to the next slide really quickly, we know that there are innovators. Folks aren't familiar with this. This is the adoption curve. So showing how it takes a while for any technology or any other, new concept to be adopted across an entire population. And we know that there are agroforestry innovators and early adopters who are chomping at the bit and ready to go. And then we know that there's early majority folks and late majority folks who aren't yet quite convinced about if agroforestry is going to be the right fit for them. So going back to the previous slide, a piece of this outreach and recruitment is getting the word out. And there are going to be producers who come to field days or attend virtual events like this, and it's their first touch point with agroforestry. And they might not plant a single tree over the next 5 years. And that is okay, because we might have planted the seed that helps them think about planting a tree in 7 years from now or 12 years from now. So this is agroforestry. We're in it for the long game. So just want to name that outreach kind of purpose that we have. But ultimately, we have this incentive payment program, which is a key piece of all of this. It's 36 million of the 60 million is direct financial support to producers to get these practices in the ground, because we know that one of the major barriers that we hear from producers is the fact that agroforestry can be a capital intensive system to put in the ground, and producers need support in order to adopt these practices. So we couple financial assistance with technical assistance, having staff from these different partner organizations that can hold a producer's hand to think through what fruit, nut, timber, or biodiversity crops are going to make sense for their operation, given what they have going on today and the vision for what they want to see in 20 plus years from now. So incentive payment program, very crucial to our program. All of that is with an aim of getting more agroforestry demonstration farms in more locations across the US. I could talk till I'm blue in the face on as many Zoom calls as possible, but ultimately producers want to hear from other producers, go visit their operations, right? Hear the good, the bad, and the ugly about what works, what's difficult with managing agroforestry and incorporating it into different types of operations. And so that's why we want to get more demonstration farms in more locations. And the fourth bucket is measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification, which Fred spoke on. It's really important for us to be able to track really the data behind, is all of this funding actually leading to the outcomes and impact that we want? So MMRV is really important for us, telling the story of what works and what doesn't. USDA considers all of these programs as pilots, and we're going to be adaptively managing across time. And so this MMRV program helps us fine tune and redirect what's working and what's not, so that we can maximize the impact of this funding. The last bucket is incredibly important. These are the enabling conditions. So as I've alluded to, agroforestry, it's up and coming and doesn't benefit from some of the enabling conditions that have been built up for kind of more classic commodities like corn, soy, wheat, you name it. Those commodities benefit from a lot of different enabling conditions that simply don't yet exist for agroforestry in the way that it needs to, if we want to see it scale to be the natural climate solution that it can be. So as part of this project, we're doing work like what Fred mentioned around market development, making sure that we have buyers that are creating that demand so that producers have more certainty when they're putting crops in. Finance options, a lot of agroforestry has unique financing needs given the lag time between putting trees and shrubs in the ground and when you actually get the harvestable offtakes. So how can we work with both philanthropy as well as more classic private financing options to figure out what are financing products that we can get into the market that truly fit the needs of agroforestry producers? Crop insurance is also a piece of this. It's important that we help de-risk these crops for producers. So we're starting with chestnuts and developing a federal crop insurance product for chestnuts, and there's other agroforestry crops that also could benefit from the de-risking that can come from crop insurance. None of these big goals are possible without nursery capacity development. We have to have the right quantity and quality of genetic stock in order to actually get profitable systems in the ground in the coming years. So working with our nursery partners so that they are supported and have what they need to be able to support us, because it's really goes both ways, right? And finally, technical training is really important, and doing train the trainer type events. There's a lot of agronomists or other, federal agency, thinking of folks like NRCS agents who might not feel fluent in agroforestry practices and might not be kind of promoting it as much as they could. And so what are the opportunities where we can help them feel more confident and fluent in what agroforestry has to offer? And so that's a part of our project as well for the long-term sustainability of supporting this beyond even just the 5 years of the project. Next slide, please. So 60 million, as I said, 36 million is direct to producer incentive payments. Excuse me, the other 24 million is to our project partners to support some of those other enabling conditions and other pieces that you see there. I'll just say it's really important to us that a majority of this project funding is going directly to producers. We're really proud of that piece because we know that it's so important to support our farmers. Next slide, please. So what is that 36 million? This is maybe why you came to this session, right? If you're a producer, you're like, what does this mean? How might I be able to tap into this funding? So we'll go into some of these details, and I'll be able to share resources in the chat at the end with some additional resources beyond just what I can quickly walk through here today during this session. So next slide, please. So this is a busy slide, sorry for that, but it's we have to have a whole process for how we select which producers we end up working with and kind of how do we support them across time. So the best first step that anybody can do is to join the email list. There's a link to the email list for TNC, and then we will direct you as a producer to whomever your regional lead is. And after you're on that email list, you're welcome to then apply. So what's really important, applying to this incentive payment program, there are, depending on your region, between 2 to 3 application cycles a year. We just opened the very first one on November 15th, and some of the first deadlines are coming up later this month or next month, depending on your region. So in case folks are feeling like, oh no, the very first deadline, there's gonna be other cycles. So please don't feel rushed. We want to make sure you have a well thought out plan before you're applying. If you are ultimately not selected into the program, I think it's important to note that you'll get feedback on your application and you'll be welcome to apply again. If you are selected into the program, it's at that stage that you'll be match made basically to a technical assistant staff member from one of our project partner organizations, and they will support you on 2 key pieces. One is creating a design for your farm, understanding kind of the budget, what you need, what are the different prep activities that you need to do, thinking through things like your procurement plan. And it's during this stage with the technical assistance, during the technical assistance stage, that staff member will help you figure out for your particular operation what incentive payment options will be for your specific farm, given the details of your particular plan. So I know that's a question we often get. You'll get to know what your farm's incentive payment might be at that technical assistance stage. The second piece that this person will help you through is holding your hand through getting the required documentation. So USDA is requiring everybody who's participating in these projects to be registered with FSA. And there's a few other pieces like CPA 52 and a little bit more of kind of alphabet soup of forms that you need to do. But the point is there are staff who are going to support you and help you with filling out those forms. And it's required paperwork so that USDA can track where all this funding is actually going and hitting the ground and with which entities. So once you have those 2 pieces, your design plan plus all the eligibility paperwork, those 2 pieces get handed to my teammate, May Bazito at TNC, and then the producer will enter an agreement with the Nature Conservancy for your incentive payment. And part of that agreement or contract will detail facts like you have 18 months to get the trees in the ground. So this is important. We know that procurement timelines can be challenging. And so we wanted to give folks 18 months so they didn't feel rushed to put in maybe less than perfect genetics. And folks will receive their first incentive payment within 60 days of signing that contract. They then plant their trees depending on basically the verification for tree planting is either photography or a site visit from staff. And again, these practices have to be done following NRCS conservation practice standards. So that's what we're looking to verify. Once we verify that, that is when that triggers the second portion of the incentive payment to the producer. And then the final piece of the incentive payment is paid out in the last year of the program, 2028, where the producer is sort of on the hook to help take those basically diameter at breast height, getting the biomass of the trees that are planted in that final year of the project. Once we get that data, that triggers within 60 days getting the final payment. So next slide, please. Something that's really important to note as part of the application is, we want to get more demonstration sites, and at the application stage, people can say if they're willing to be a demonstration site, which means that they, at a minimum, will have a once per year field day that might be scheduled with the regional lead organization. So it's basically raising your hand saying, I don't mind if people come to my farm and see what I'm doing. Really want to encourage that, but again, it's optional. Another encouraged but optional piece is if you're willing to have your operation be a science research site. So while we have a robust MMRV plan, we have an amazing opportunity right now to capture baseline data at all of these operations that are just getting agroforestry in the ground, and a huge opportunity to do long-term longitudinal monitoring research beyond even just the 5 years of this grant. And so we really want to encourage that. We want to help our science partners know who are the producers who are willing to have that data done on their land. The next slide. Thank you. I'm going to just put this up really quickly to explain that there's two major categories. Highly recommend you do some reading on our website to really dive into this more. But there's two major categories. Category one includes a per tree installation cost incentive coupled with a transition incentive of $450 per acre. So what's important here, you can see in that second piece about the payment schedule, 70% of the incentive payment is paid once you sign that contract with the Nature Conservancy after the technical assistance phase. It was really important to us. We know that there are challenges with other programs where it's a reimbursement basis, and that can be really challenging for farmers to kind of foot the bill and cash flow wise to get these practices in the ground and wait for an uncertain amount of time to get reimbursed. So we really tried to front load supporting those installation costs as early as possible, while still having that certainty of verifying you actually planted the trees and then getting that final data that we need. An important note that I just want to name, with this particular program, it cannot be stacked or coupled with other NRCS program funding like EQIP, CSP, or CRP. And it also cannot be coupled for the same practice on the same land with other PCSC projects. So it's a really important qualifier that I just really want to name for everybody. The next category, next slide, please, is category two. In category two, those installation costs, the kind of the per tree installation cost, that is covered by a third party, maybe a private financer or maybe a philanthropic funding source. This is a way where the producer is coming to the table saying, I already have funding to help put these trees in the ground, and I'm looking to get a transition incentive. And so this second category is important for us to help build out that menu of financing options for producers for the long haul, right? Because this 36 million, 5 years is going to come and go before we know it. And so how can we help build out those options for producers today so that they're around for the long haul? So importantly, this is where we want producers stacking with other programs, but it cannot be NRCS or other PCSC projects. Next slide, please. This is a question we get a lot. What are the minimums? What are the maximums? So the minimum for most places is 5 acres, except Hawaii, it goes down to 1 acre. There's no minimum or floor for funding for individual projects. The maximum any individual or entity can get through this program is 450. That mirrors what exists for the NRCS EQIP program, but important to note, producers can still get the full 450K from EQIP. Just again, has to be a different practice on different acreage on their operation. And so there's no acreage maximum. There's just kind of a funding ceiling. Next slide, please. Eligibility requirements. The last bullet point says what I think is most important. The full eligibility details are in an FAQ document that I will link to once I'm done talking. But just some of the key ones to name here. Location, you got to be in one of the 30 states. Land control is really important. We get this question a lot. It's important for us with this program to make it accessible to underserved producers. And we know that underserved producers often might not be landowners and they might be leasing land. And so in order to meet both USDA requirements as well as make this as accessible as possible, we've kind of thread the needle that we need producers at the time of contracting with the Nature Conservancy to be able to say that they have control of the land through a lease through 2028. So I just want to name here, if you don't yet have a lease through 2028, you're still welcome to apply, but you won't be able to fully enroll in contract with TNC for the payments unless you have that secured lease through 2028. If you own your own land, obviously that's no problem and you are eligible. Required paperwork's really important, kind of already touched on that, but you got to make sure you can dot all your I's and cross all your T's for those different pieces that, again, staff are there to help support you and walking you through. You do not have to have those pieces done at the time of applying. We support you there at the time of technical assistance to complete all of those. Got to follow NRCS conservation practice standards, and then you also have to be willing to kind of be on the hook to help with that MMRV data collection. For the soil test, that looks like Yardstick, the contractor that Fred already mentioned, having them come out to your land to collect those soil samples, and you will have access to looking at that data of those soil samples. Next slide, please. So supporting underserved producers is really important to us. For this particular program, these are the 7 categories that USDA kind of has categorized. So the classic 5 that you might have seen for the historically underserved producers, plus 2 additionals, specialty crop producers, as well as small farms. So those are the 7. Next slide, please. So we have an online application. Really important. There's going to be future application cycles. Please don't feel rushed that you got to get yours in, by the next, this first deadline. There's going to be 2 to 3 application cycles throughout the lifetime of this grant. Please connect with your regional lead to learn more program details that you might have. And as you're going through and developing your application, the more details, the better. So if you have a business plan, if you have a map, anything that you can share with us helps give us the most robust sense of, is this a project that makes sense for our particular program? So the more the merrier in terms of details on your application. Next slide, please. So the FAQ document, I kind of, walked through as much as I could given the short presentation time that we have, but the FAQ document is about 11 pages long, and we really developed it to hopefully answer a lot of the questions that we frequently receive. So please take a look, read that. And if you still have questions, expandingagroforestry@tnc.org is an email that you can shoot us an email if there's additional questions that you don't feel like you have answered, and or of course reach out to Savanna Institute or whomever your regional lead is if you have more questions. Next slide, please. I think it's important to note, while I just detailed the program for Expanding Agroforestry project, there's other partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities grants that are supporting agroforestry implementation. Ours is the project that is solely focused on agroforestry, but there are others out there as well. So I really encourage you to check out and see if there's other programs from PCSC that could make sense for your operation. NRCS, kind of the classic programs like EQIP, CSP, CRP, they're really benefiting right now with an expansion of capacity of funding from the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's a great time because there's funding there. And then finally, there's expanding private donor and third-party financing options available that, of course, can be stacked with our Category 2 or not. And so one example I just want to name here is Virginia Tech, along with other partners, leads the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program. So I recommend checking that one out as well. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Barbara, because as I named earlier, we have these regional leads. TNC, we're sort of, at the high level helping to do air traffic control at the national level, but none of this is possible without our partners who are really grounded in these regions and can help make place-based recommendations for all of the producers that are going to be receiving technical assistance. So Barbara is going to dive in and explain what that's like for those that might be working with Savanna Institute. So thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. Hi, everyone. My name is Barbara Decré. I'm the Agroforestry Programs Manager at the Savanna Institute. That means I kind of coordinate our efforts towards the technical service program when it comes to outreach, education, and communication. And when it comes to this partnership, I'm kind of the point person. So I see a lot of questions coming in the chat. Feel free to drop those questions again. If we don't get to answer them today, you can send me an email and I'll answer them for you. But I want to kind of quickly walk you through what it's like to work with a technical service provider, at least at Savanna Institute. So again, on this map, you see all the partners and where they are working. If your state is not on this map, that means that there is no funding through TNC and the Expanding Agroforestry project. That doesn't mean that agroforestry is not available to you or that NRCS or other organizations don't have funding. It just means that you won't be able to apply for this specific funding. So if you work in the Midwest, so upper Midwest here is Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan, and Indiana, you will be working with one of our technical service providers here on this slide. So I want to tell you a bit more about how we work through technical assistance, and I want to be quick about it so we have time for questions. But every single organization and program will have a different kind of process, but it might look similar to ours. That's why I want to introduce it to you. So our program kind of comes in at this third step here that Audrey kind of presented. After you've submitted your own application, your own initial project, you will hopefully get pre-selected, pre-approved, and get matched with a technical service provider in your area. So in the upper Midwest, it will be somebody from Savanna Institute. For us, I want to point, if you are already ready, if you have a plan, if you have an idea you've been working on for a while and you need funding for it, the deadline this year for application is December 15th. But again, as Audrey mentioned, this is a 5-year program. We have a lot of money to hand out to farmers. So there will be other opportunities to sign up and get assistance. So feel free to take your time to even reach out to a Savanna Institute in the upper Midwest already to kind of think about your project. But basically, the first step of working with a technical service provider is painting this big picture of what is my agroforestry system going to look like. And as part of Savanna Institute, we're going to ask you to work on a farm narrative. It's a document that's going to kind of look over who should be involved in the decision-making process and at what level, what kind of goals and objective, and what's your purpose in doing agroforestry, but also looking at your resources and the challenges or opportunities that your land will present. It's a great opportunity to kind of sit down and think about the future of your farm and do something that we don't really get to do in annual farming, which is paint this picture for the next 5, 15, or 30 years. If that's something that you're interested in, I'm actually going to be leading a workshop on Friday morning at 9 a.m. where we're going to sit down and dream together about what those agroforestry systems might look like. Once you have this farm narrative written down, your local technical service provider will go on a site visit with you to kind of help ground this vision into the reality of your landscape and see what will fit and what will work. They will collect a lot of information and kind of analyze that data, including which hardiness zone your land is located in, information about the topography of the land, about the soil types and the water, and basically pull all of this together to provide you with assistance in deciding which trees to pick. At Savanna Institute, we've developed this tool that the technical service providers use to kind of analyze suitability of some of the crops and figure out based on soil types and zones and soil texture and goals also what kind of agroforestry crops you might want to grow. And then they will help you map out your design. So you might already have some kind of a design, something that might be on the back of a napkin or something very developed. Submit all of that in your application. And then your technical service provider in that later step will help you finalize it to submit to TNC for funding. So yeah, after that, we'll help you review and finalize your design, gather all the USDA required documents for application, submit for contracting, hopefully get you your money soon, and then help you order trees to implement your design. We can also recommend some practitioners that will help you implement your agroforestry systems in case you don't have the equipment. And hopefully your design ends up looking like the change on the landscape that you've always dreamed about. So again, as Audrey mentioned, there's also an optional kind of sign up opportunity for hosting researchers and events on your farms. This is really something that's super important in getting farmers and landowners to learn about agroforestry. It's the opportunity to develop a really robust scale set of knowledge and database information, but also for people to learn from each other on the ground. So again, if you're not in the upper Midwest, if you're not going to be working with the Savanna Institute, here's a list of the other organizations you might be working with in the future. I recommend checking out the Nature Conservancy's website, so nature.org/expanding agroforestry. The page includes this map and information about the program, but also resources about agroforestry and the different partners. So I'm going to wrap it up so we can answer some of the questions right away. I'm going to ask that we keep the questions at the level of the programs rather than specific to people's land. If you have a specific question about your application or your specific case and you're in the upper Midwest, feel free to send me an email and I will schedule a conversation with you or answer it by email. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to move to the Q&A.
Should we start working through the questions in the chat?
Yeah, I have some of the questions on a side document. So we had a question about people who don't yet have access to land, and I think you kind of answered it quickly. Do you want to give a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the questions was if folks are beginning farmers who do not yet have land, can this fund getting the land? And this is funding that's really focused on folks who already have control of land, either through a lease or own their own land. This funding is not eligible to be used for land purchases.
Great. Fred, the next question is probably for you. 5 years is not that long of a time compared to the lifespan of trees for monitoring carbon sequestration. Will there be follow-up with any of the farms after the 5 years?
Yeah, that's a great observation. So in terms of this Climate Smart Commodities project itself, so there's no funding and no requirement for data collection to happen, monitoring to happen after 5 years. That said, there's a lot of us that sure hope and we'll sure be working towards all the farmers that are interested in that happening, having that happen on their land here. We're in an era here where the cost of this data collection is much lower than it was in the past, and so that makes me optimistic that between TNC, between the Savanna Institute, between a couple other organizations involved that have research interests here, that will have a viable plan. Audrey, is there anything more specific than that can be said at the national or project level on this?
Yeah, I think it's important as we're developing this database of, again, producers who are kind of raising their hand saying, I'm willing to have additional scientific inquiry done on my farm. That database is going to be great for having additional science, additional research happen around ecosystem services, or could be interdisciplinary around anthropology or economics. It really just, it opens it up beyond just, carbon story that is most pertinent for MMRV. It's really kind of expanding the circle of scientific inquiry. And again, going beyond just the 5 years, because long-term nature of agroforestry, these benefits happen later.
Quick question after that is, do you need to be the actual landowner to apply?
So you don't have to be the actual landowner, but you do need to have a lease through 2028.
Great. Then we have a few people who have asked questions about clarifying the NRCS funding. Can you apply for EAP funding if you've previously received NRCS funding? What about CRP funding from before and past NRCS funding?
So if you have prior contracts with NRCS, and if you if folks are familiar with these, there's sort of terms of these contracts for a certain set number of years. So if you have an open contract that has not finished, that is for these practices on the exact same acreage, that acreage would not be eligible. However, if you have closed out contracts, then that's something where we can talk you through, because it's just that you can't have active NRCS contracts for the same practice on the same land. And importantly, you're welcome to apply for NRCS funding with these other programs as well as our program. Ultimately, though, you'll kind of have to decide which one you do. You can't do both, but you can kind of put your eggs in 2 baskets and see which you get into. We certainly welcome that.
Yeah. Hey, Audrey, there's a question that just came up that's a great follow-up on this. Is the acreage measurement the total acres covered by the agroforestry field, or just the actual footprint of the tree practice in the field?
That's a great question. It depends on the practice. So Eli, I'm happy to follow up with you there, because it's really hard to explain without actually having visuals and slides. So feel free to email expandingagroforestry@tnc.org, and I can explain that more.
Can this be combined with a SARE grant involving tree planting?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that's a great.
SARE is considered non-federal dollars for most or all purposes, I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fine.
One of the more recent question is about the planning process. Sounds kind of long, and it has to be with long-term planning and long-term agroforestry systems. So when does the 18-month clock start, and do the designs have to be finalized before?
Sure. So we kind of, I don't know, Barbara, if you can pop open the kind of journey, if you will, through the program. When folks apply, it's usually that you have an idea of your plan. Some folks have more complex plans already at the time of application. Other people are just getting into it for the first time. That's step 2 when you apply. Once you are selected into the program, that step 3 is when you receive the heavy technical assistance with a staff member. That's when you kind of finalize your plan and you get all the details. That process, it can take a different amount of time depending on the complexities of the operation or the project at hand. So there's no time limit in terms of how long step 3 takes. It's really dependent on the engagement between the technical assistance staff and how responsive the producer is to getting back in developing that plan. The clock for the 18 months starts at step 4. Once you have a signed contract agreement with TNC, that's when the clock starts for 18 months. So I hope that helped answer the question. Barbara, you're muted, sorry.
Thank you. I was getting back to my list of questions. Somebody asked, what are the advantages or disadvantages of using this program versus planting trees with a 10 or 15-year NRCS or FSA program?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question. Where is that question? I want to make sure I got that right. So I think what's important to note is with our program, what we're excited to offer is the stage of having the technical assistance. So I think unlike there can be a wide range of levels of expertise around agroforestry depending on who your local NRCS office has as staff. And so with our program, you're really going to get a really bespoke opportunity to develop out your plan. And that's a free service that's provided thanks to this award supporting the staff time in the budget. And so I think that's something that makes it unique. And also the kind of the dollar amount typically comes out higher in terms of a schedule, payment schedule across time. So typically producers like that piece too.
One question that we received earlier was about if this payment is for trees, what if you already have planted trees and you're looking for funding to add pasture or cropping programs back into the orchard? Would there be funding for reestablishing animal or cropping programs to large orchards?
So that's a good question. So we've gotten this question before from also other early adopters who have said, hey, I've already put trees in, can I get paid for that? And unfortunately, due to kind of the restrictions on the award, we can't retroactively pay early adopters for having put trees in, which I know isn't totally fair, but is the nature of the funding. It can only put in new trees. And so with that said, folks who have already put trees in, if you have additional acreage and you want to expand your operation, you are very welcome to apply for that new acreage and that expansion of new trees. In terms of getting kind of incorporating a pasture back into an orchard, this isn't quite the right program for that. We're really more of a program for if you have pasture adding trees. So I might recommend reaching out to NRCS and seeing if there's opportunities for rotational grazing or other practices.
We technically only have 4 minutes left, but we're going to stay open probably another 5 minutes after the time. So if you want to stick around and get your questions answered. Otherwise, again, feel free to shoot me an email at barbara@savannainstitute.org. One of the questions we received was about long-term plans that have multiple steps of establishment. Is it possible for people to apply for one step and then apply again for the next phase of their implementation?
Yes, I'd recommend for those applications to, if you have that vision for the long term, to kind of share that in your plan and then to say, hey, this is sort of the piece, the first step of the puzzle that we want to do implementation for. And then you could apply then in future years for a second step. So it's, I guess the other way I want to say this is I really want to encourage, or we really want to encourage producers to scale their plans for what's appropriate for what they're ready to bite off and chew at this time. We don't want people going too big. And at the other end of the, other side of that is we don't want people doing projects that are too small and aren't likely to be profitable. So there's really kind of finding that Goldilocks zone that makes sense for your operations really important.
Another good question we received is, are bushes like hybrid hazelnut classified as trees in this program? And can they be planted at higher density than trees?
Good question. Sorry, I should say trees and shrubs more frequently. Yes, shrubs are very much welcome.
Sorry, I lost my questions again. Can the acreage be split between practices, or is it 5-acre minimum for silvopasture and 5-acre minimum for alley cropping? What if the plan includes both?
That's a good question. We haven't gotten that question before. I mean, I think it's important to note that 5 acres typically is seen per practice would be best, but I think at this stage you're welcome to apply if it's a mix that still adds up to 5. I just again want to say it's important to find that Goldilocks zone, that it's going to be profitable, it's going to make sense. If an alley cropping system is too tiny, you're probably not going to capture the economies of scale around harvesting and processing that's going to make sense for the long term.
I'm glad we're getting through as many questions as possible. The next one is a really good one too. Can you qualify if you don't yet have animals, for instance, to convert hayland into silvopasture?
Yes, that is not a problem. If you have a vision for adding grazing into the operation, that's not an issue if you don't have animals yet. Similarly, we also have other folks who are planning to lease, like have a neighbor lease the grazing land. So they're just managing the alley cropping, but having a neighbor bring their sheep in, for example. So that's another option.
Oops, I muted myself. Can you be eligible for funding on multiple farm sites?
So another way this question has been asked is, do the acres have to be contiguous? And this again goes back to, there's a lot of efficiencies if it can all be in the same place. But that's not an issue if kind of you have to do it across two different fields that you own. That's fine.
We have seen a couple of questions about some of the funding that's not yet eligible. So the Southeast region doesn't have funding this year. And then are there other programs for other parts of the country that are not involved in this program?
That's a great question. So the Southeast, Tuskegee University is our regional lead in the Southeast, and they are staffing up their capacity. So they are not participating in this very first iteration of the application cycle, but they will be opening up in summer of what year is that? 24. In summer of 24 is when the Southeast will open up their applications. So Southeast, you're coming. It's not like a first come, first serve. The Southeast has their allotment of funding, and it's not being touched by other regions.
I also saw a comment / question about training technical service provider and FSA about agroforestry. That's part of the effort that's being fostered by this grant funding. So each region has hired technical service providers to help with those plans and the implementation of the designs. But we're also trying to really enhance technical assistance throughout the US. And so Savanna Institute in particular and Missouri University Center for Agroforestry are leads in educating technical service providers, NRCS agents, and a kind of agriculture professionals that could provide assistance. And so there's efforts to coordinate training for technical service providers, and that includes those specialists that you've mentioned. We're at time. If you want to move on with your day and your night, you feel free to jump off. Otherwise, we got a question about, is there a max of trees per acre that's allowed?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd say when you're working at the technical assistance stage, that's when that staff member is going to help you think through what the right density is for whatever species or species mix you're doing with whatever intercrop. So it's going to really depend. I'd say there's not exactly a max. I know that, fodder crops like mulberries and willows, that's probably going to have a really high density if you're doing like a fodder bank. On the lower end of things, my understanding is that silvopasture at 30 trees per acre is sort of the minimum that we're looking at.
Specific question about alley cropping. Does growing hay between rows count as alley cropping?
Yes, it does.
Perfect. Meredith has a question about the federal chestnut insurance that you mentioned, if you have any more information to share about timing and backstory.
Yes. So we are starting what is likely a 2-year process with working with the Risk Management Agency, RMA, of USDA. So much alphabet soup at you guys, my apologies, but RMA is the entity that manages federal crop insurance for USDA. And so they have a process for when entities want to apply for new products. To develop all of the basically actuarial science to understand what goes into operating effectively growing those crops effectively, and basically doing the due diligence of, does it make sense to insure this crop or not? And so what I highly recommend, if you want to nerd out about this, is the Northern Nut Growers Association is going to have a meeting in Syracuse next summer, and we're going to be giving a kind of a presentation and update at that time. So that would probably be the best next step to learn more on chestnut insurance. And I'll just note, we're both looking to develop actually 2 products. One is around the chestnut nuts themselves, as well as the chestnut trees. So if something like a tornado comes through and knocks out your trees, you're obviously missing revenue. So it's both sides of that production, and that mirrors what already exists for pecans.
We're going to take 2 questions then before we close up. For sites without water, is drilling a well for watering trees a practice that's eligible for funding?
So we really want to make sure that everybody is doing what they need to do to ensure success for their project. So drilling wells is not explicitly allowable with this funding. That said, that transition incentive of $450 per acre is sort of it's up to the producer to determine what they need to do to ensure success of the system. So, for example, that transition funding in your case might go to support helping offset the cost of drilling a well. So.
And then to close up, Wade was asking if we could give an overview of the total application time, having missed the beginning of the presentation. Do you want to do that, Audrey?
Yeah, sure. So everybody's welcome to apply to, enter the email list at any time. Once you apply, it's typically 3 to 4 months that you'll hear back from the producer. It really depends when you get your application in, and depending on your region, if they do 2 or 3 application cycles a year, how quickly you'll hear back, but roughly 3 to 4 months. Then you'll know the status of if you're entering into the program or not. If you enter into the program, that's when you go through the technical assistance phase. That time varies between 2 to 6 months, perhaps. And then you contract with TNC, and then you have 18 months to plant your trees. And everybody will be contracted through 2028 because that's when we need that last data collection on tree biomass. So no matter what year you enter the program, everybody will kind of end in 2028. So for folks who apply later in the program, it'll be a little bit more condensed in terms of how much time you have to get everything done.
Great. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Fred, for your time. I'm going to share my email again. If you're in the upper Midwest and you have questions about this application round or what could be eligible, again, this for the upper Midwest, we are closing application on December 15th, which is really soon, but don't worry, there's going to be more opportunities to apply for funding in the future. Feel free to send out your questions now. We also have our technical service program that you can sign up for already, even if you're not, you haven't sent your application yet. You can start working with a technical service provider and then submit that plan to your application and kind of get ahead in the design process. That's an opportunity that we can offer at Savanna Institute because we've been doing technical assistance for a couple of years. Other states and regions might not be able to help you ahead of your application for the EAP funding. So I'm going to close us up. Thank you so much for attending, for asking so many great questions. I hope we've answered responded to some of your concerns or questions about this new funding. We're really excited about the opportunity to actually get money in the ground in the form of trees and support agroforestry systems and their implementation.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks for all the great questions.